Okay, well, good evening. I wanted Fred here as well because a lot of what I'm going to present tonight was actually written up in some tremendous research that Fred has done, and we're going to go back and forth because Fred knows this inside and out. In EIR magazine, you can read an article. This is from November 10th, 2023. The 1619 Project is bunk. Mass slavery in America was made in England. John Locke, godfather of the Confederacy. And this is remarkable because when I first was asked to do this on the Massachusetts Bay Colony, I know a bit about the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the goodness of that, but what was really, really remarkable was that when I came upon this article, what you see is the exact, the counter to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which is launched at the same exact time by the British oligarchy, the Anglo-Dutch oligarchy specifically. So we're going to get into the details on this, which is absolutely fascinating. And I think it's important for people to think about that the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was founded in 1629, consider that, 1629 to say, the Declaration of Independence in 1776, that's 150 years. There's a lot of time there of a fight to establish Republican government long before you think of the establishment of our republic, right? So this is going on. This is way before Leibniz, for example, which we'll talk about here. But what I wanted to start with, if you can put up the first slide, it would be a fraud to speak of the creation of the United States Republic without mentioning Nicholas of Cusa, because this critical figure, who was really discovered by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, Lyndon LaRouche's wife, is a remarkable figure. He's a scientist. He's a theologian. He's a Renaissance person, and I'm going to show you a quote. So he was born in 1401, lived till 1461. This is from a book that he wrote called the Concordancia Catholica, and I'll read this section. He says, "Hence, since natural law is based on reason, all law is rooted by nature in the reason of man." All law is by nature rooted in the reason of man. The wiser and more outstanding men are chosen as rulers by the others to draw up just laws by the clear reason, wisdom, and prudence given them by nature, and to rule the others by these laws and to decide controversies for the maintenance of peace. From this we conclude that those better endowed with reason are the natural lords and masters of the others, but not by any coercive law or judgment imposed on someone against his will. No slavery, no oligarchy, but government based on reason. And he goes on to say, "For since all are by nature free, every governance, whether it consists in a written law or in the living law in the person of a prince, can only come from the agreement and consent of the subjects. For if men are by nature equal in power and equally free, the true, properly ordered authority of one common ruler, who is their equal in power, can only be constituted by the election and consent of the others, and law is also established by consent." So this is from 1430, somewhere around there, 14, yeah. So that's 350 years before the Declaration of Independence. So that's remarkable. So the point is that you had people in Europe, you had thinkers in Europe who were intent on creating this idea actively in government. They couldn't do it in Europe because the place was too decadent, too oligarchical, but they had this idea. All right, so here is John Winthrop. He is the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he, like Cusa, saw the necessity to escape what he called the perversity and corruption of oligarchical Europe. And so he was the first really to be able to fulfill this idea of Cusa in the New World, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So he wished to create this Renaissance. And he wrote in 1629 a document called Reasons to be Considered for Justifying the Plantation in New England. And he lays out the moral necessity of creating this republic in the New World. And here's what he says. He says, "This land of England grows weary of her inhabitants, so as man, who is the most precious of all creatures, is here most vile and base than the earth we tread on, more vile and base than the earth we tread on, and of less price among us than a horse or a sheep. We use the authority of the law to hinder the increase of people, and thus it has come to pass that children, servants, and neighbors, especially if they be poor, are counted the greatest burden, which, if things were right, would be counted the chiefest earthly blessing," these poor children. And he says, "The whole earth is the Lord's garden, and he hath given it to the sons of men with a general condition." Genesis 1:28, "Increase and multiply, replenish the earth and subdue it." So that's Winthrop's reasoning for creating this Massachusetts Bay Colony. And under his command, 800 passengers on 4 ships arrived in Salem, Massachusetts. He gave a sermon when they got there, a model of Christian charity, in which he says, "For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." So he's fully conscious of the fact that this republic is the beginning of something very, very exciting and important for mankind. The eyes of all people are upon us. And within a short period of time, there were about 20,000 people that came over to this new colony. All right, so the next slide. So now this is where Fred's work comes in, which I didn't know, and is really remarkable. This is the other colony created by the British in 1629, the Barbados sugar plantation. And Fred, do you want to jump in and say anything about that, or?
Well, sure. In 1629, it was still fairly benign, but the plantations in Barbados were large. They had a handful of indentured servants and slaves on them. Most of them were white Europeans. The beginning of turning Barbados into a monstrosity begins in 1640. And what happens is first of all, they passed the laws 4 years beforehand. 4 years before, in 1636, they passed laws saying that slavery is hereditary, it's lifelong, and you have no rights. Why did they do that? They don't even have any slaves yet. They're planning some of that. So in 1640, I mean, and Barbados is a haven for escaped monarchists as the Civil War goes on and after the execution of Charles I. So a guy named Colonel James Drax goes to Brazil, buys a triple sugar rolling mill, several cauldrons, brings it back and starts building, creating sugar plantations on Barbados. Whereas previous farms only employed a handful of people, sugar plantations employed between 100 and 150 people. It was brutal work. A slave could only expect to live for about 10 years. And they brought in black Africans to do it. That's what they did. That's why they passed those laws about slavery being racial before they even started it. It was a plan. They had a plan going. So the nature of Barbados changed so much that the number of landowners went from over 8,000 to about 790 because nobody was interested in growing. They just drove everybody else out. All they wanted was sugar. So it was more and more of these huge sugar plantations. Towards the late 1600s, Barbados didn't even grow food. They had to import food because they weren't going to waste any land that could grow sugar on that. Okay? And so they had a situation that was just terrible. But by 1685, black African slaves outnumbered white settlers in Barbados 4-1. And the settlers were so scared that they passed laws that a slave could be branded in the face with a hot iron merely for showing the slightest opposition to a Christian. That's what Barbados had become. And you want me to go into Carolina a little bit?
Well, let's go. Wait. Yeah.
Let's wait. Okay.
Yeah. Because it's because so that's what's happening there now. In 1638, the Charles I, who is the son of James I, is now king, and he attempts to revoke the charter for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This is right around the same time that all these developments are going on in Barbados. So John Winthrop forms a militia at this point in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he responds to King Charles with a statement, with a letter. He says, "If our patent be taken from us, the common people here will conceive that His Majesty has cast them off, and that hereby they are freed from their allegiance and subjugation, and will therefore be ready to confederate themselves under a new government for their necessary safety and subsistence." So he's saying, well, if you take away our charter, then we'll just, you're casting us off. I mean, then we'll have to just create our own government. So there's already this idea that, hey, we're really our own republic. We're not part of this rotten British Empire. And then from 1639 to 1660 in England, you have a whole series of wars, the 3 civil wars and other things. So there's absolute chaos going on. Charles I loses his head, quite literally. And during this time, if you can go to the next slide, John Winthrop Jr., and he is the founder of the Saugus Iron Works. So as opposed to slaves on a sugar plantation, what Massachusetts Bay is interested in doing is building the most scientific, technologically advanced ironworks probably on the planet. I mean, at a certain point, they're outproducing England by far in these ironworks. This is in 1647. And so it's a completely automated, integrated industrial complex. They make big sheets of iron that are then, blacksmiths can use to make tools and all kinds of stuff. It's totally. Now I will say there are indentured servants working here, mainly to pay for their trip over to the New World, and they can become free once they have worked to pay off their fare to come to the New World. So they're not going to be slaves for the rest of their lives. Their kids aren't going to be slaves. Their grandchildren aren't going to be slaves. They're not going to be branded as slaves. They're not from Africa, so this is not a racial question. So it's a completely different situation. Okay, so next slide. Now here's the other. Would you like to pass this around? Okay, great.
One of the original pine
Michelle was lucky enough to be up at the Saugus Ironworks. Yeah, I still have not gotten there myself. I'd love to go, but we're passing around a replica of the pine tree shilling of 1652. So the colony at this point further established its sovereignty when the General Court of Massachusetts Bay authorized the creation of a mint. And until then, only kings could mint money, so now they were minting their own money, and this was used for circulation only within the Massachusetts Bay colony. This new currency was called the Pine Tree Shilling. It was only redeemable in the colony, and it was designed to stop the foreign draining of the colony's hard currency. The currency's main value, however, was not the silver. The currency's main value was the sovereign intention of the government to use the currency as credit to finance the physical economic development of the colony, of its infrastructure, of its agriculture, of its industry, shipbuilding, etc. So all right, so let's go to the next slide. 1660, the Stuarts are put back into power. Charles II comes in. His brother James II, Duke of York, founds the Royal African Company. And the Royal African Company, its main mission is to run the slave trade. This company, they carried more African slaves to the Americas than any other company in the history of the Atlantic slave trade. So more than Spanish, the Portuguese. I mean, these guys.
Led the world.
They led the world, yes, in running black chattel slavery into the New World. So this is clearly an escalation of something evil, and with a clear design to destroy any potential that the Massachusetts Bay Colony might represent of a new republic. And so, if you want to slide 8, the next slide. There are 8 wealthy noblemen who proposed the Carolina Act. One of them is Sir Anthony Ashley Cooper, Lord of Shaftesbury, 3rd Lord of Shaftesbury, I believe. And he is, as Fred calls him, the ringleader of this operation. Would you like to take over from here on the Carolinas?
On the Carolinas? Okay, sure. Let me just point out one thing. I mean, first of all, all of this, I was thrilled 30 years ago when Graham Lowry wrote a book called How the Nation Was Won.
Right.
Because we didn't know anything about before the American Revolution. We knew religious freedom, but where did it come from? And he said, my God, this is the issue from the beginning. This is the founding of a free society. They were fighting to prevent their freedom from being taken away, like the Swiss in Schiller's Will and Tell. And look, you got to realize that what happened. How did the Saugus Iron Works be producing so much iron, more than England in 1647? I mean, Michelle was talking about the Iron Act of 1750 today, but there's no way that the English would have allowed that to happen in a colony, except that England was completely destabilized from about 1629 to 1660. In 1629, Charles I declared solitary rule. It's called the 11 Years' Tyranny. He disbanded Parliament and ruled the whole country as a tyrant. And when Winthrop did this thing with the militia, that was still going on. It was still the solid. And he did this. He made that statement, as you said, with the militia, because it was, if you invade us, we're going to make a revolution. I first read that in Graham's book, and I said, that sounds like the Declaration of Independence. You know?
Exactly.
So they were not able to control the colonies, and they were getting ahead. So in 1660, with the restoration of the monarchy, with King Charles II, they're in a panic. And they're in a panic to get they plan to be an empire. I know they do. The minute that Charles gets in, this terrible poet named John Dryden writes a poem called Astrea Redux, the restoration of the stars. And he says, but like the sea in boundless circles flow, your much-loved fleet shall with a wide command besiege the petty monarchs of the land. They're talking about it. The empire is the idea. And the first thing they got to do is they've got to get the empire under control. And so they immediately set up a council of trade and a council of plantations. Shaftesbury, he's Anthony Coupler at the time. He later becomes the first Earl of Shaftesbury. He is, one of his biographers referred to him as the closest thing to a colonial minister England has ever had. He was on the Hudson's Bay Company. He was he led the Carolina Lord Proprietors. He was on the Bermuda Company. He was on everything. So what did they do? They start having reviews to say, how can we revoke these freedoms and charters of the people in Massachusetts? And the minute that he gets in, the city of Boston sends a petition saying, you better remember that your father gave us our freedom and you better not do anything to take it away. In 1664, Charles II sends 4 royal commissioners over to the colonies, and they're coming here to make trouble and get the colonies under control. Charles actually issued secret orders, which have been revealed, if I can find them. Well, anyhow, he says, it's to bring that, oh, here it is, yeah. This is the orders he issued to the royal commissioners coming here. And he said, he said, the purpose is to totally bring this colony to the submission to our will, and matters of profit should be set aside for the moment. You're not in this to make a profit. They came to the town of Hadley, and they were saying, we're looking for regicides. We're looking for people who actually voted to cut the king's head off, because that is a capital crime. They could be executed, and anybody who harbors them can be executed. And in fact, there were a couple people who had voted to decapitate the king in Hadley, and they were looking for him. And the town of Hadley sent a petition, basically saying, if God gives us these rights, what right does a king have to take them away? So you immediately got that, the attempt to revoke the Massachusetts Bay Charter, to revoke the Connecticut Charter. Connecticut got its charter 2 years later. It was almost as good. In 1662, only 2 years after Charles was back in, John Winthrop Jr., who is Winthrop's son, who is the governor of Connecticut, goes to England, brings some money. He knows a lot of people there. He talks to them, and he gets Charles to give them a new charter. So Connecticut gets a new charter, and they're almost independent, right? So they're fighting to keep on to their freedom. 1663, Shaftesbury and 7 other men who helped get Charles back into office become what they petition the king for a new colony to be called Carolina. And they say, we want a colony called Carolina, which will extend all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Okay? Now, here's the deal. They'd already been building up this thing in 1640 in preparation, because it was a monarchist refuge, and Charles had enough clout in Barbados that 10 years before he got back in, he got his buddy, Lord Willoughby, appointed as the governor of Barbados. So the monarchy is already running Barbados before they're reestablished. One of the Carolina Lord proprietors, Sir John Colleton, is a Barbados planter. His son is in Barbados, and he has already formed a corporation called the Company of Barbadian Adventurers. They've got ships. They are ready to take the planters and the slaves from Barbados and ship them to Carolina the minute that they get this thing. And that is headed by Shaftesbury. But Shaftesbury is also the guy who's leading the efforts to revoke the rights of Massachusetts and the rest of it. They go back and forth on this for a while. John Locke becomes Shaftesbury's assistant, and after that, he's with him every step of the way. Every step of the way. So I mean, do you want to go back, or do you want me to continue with this for a bit?
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So here's the idea is they've already transported the Brazilian sugar slave model to Barbados. Out of the 12 million black Africans who were shipped to the New World over the years, 5.5 million of them went to Brazil. Okay. Charles marries Braganza, the princess of the Portuguese princess that runs Brazil. All right. So they move this into Brazil. Now, to Barbados, from Brazil to Barbados. Now the plan is to move it wholesale to the American colonies and build a slave plantation. They actually offer money and free land to people who will bring them over. Now, to get ready for this, there's already been slave rebellions around the place, including in Barbados, and they want to be ready for it. John Locke, working under Shaftesbury's command, writes what are known as the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina, and they're the most hideous thing you've ever seen. He says that it's a hereditary oligarchy. The 8 lord proprietors run everything. Their children run everything. It sticks within these guys. They have all the offices. He says slavery will allow blacks to go to any church they want, but they are the property of their masters. And even serfdom. He calls them leap men, which is that, you're going to be a white person is going to be like a serf in medieval Europe. This is the worst thing you've ever seen, and it's actually, you can see that this is also part of trying to revoke the freedoms that we have in Massachusetts and in New England, because it's trying to restore feudalism. That's essentially what they're doing with it. So they get this ready. It's about 1670 before they actually start building up Charleston, South Carolina. Within 3 years, half the population of Carolina is Barbadian. Half, the whites and the blacks. Okay? The slave population starts increasing so massively that by 1727, 69.5% of the population of Carolina, South Carolina, are black African slaves. Nothing like this has ever existed in the United States before, in the American colonies. Now, everybody who justifies it said, well, it's the profit motive, there's a lot of money to be made in this. Well, wait a minute. Massachusetts was the richest state, and it was an industrial state, and there was never more than 2 to 3% of their population enslaved, whereas in Carolina, they were making a lot of money on sugar in Barbados, and they were running out of land, so the British were trying to start new sugar colonies in Jamaica and Guyana, but Carolina was too far north to grow sugar. So what's the basis of trying to export this model to Carolina if you don't really even have a crop? It ended up producing rice, but the type of rice that became their, they got rich for it, called Carolina Gold, was not introduced to 1685. And some people say they didn't start making a profit in rice until 1700, when they brought in the Gula people from Africa. Because the Gula people were on the rice coast and they knew how to grow rice. So, and there's a very funny story, I haven't corroborated it, but when they first brought the Gula people in, they were done with their work by noon, and the white masters didn't know what the hell to do with them, because they were useless. The white people, they prided themselves on being effete and lazy and not working. So Yeah, so that's what you've actually got, and this is quite deliberate. And
Well, that's the point that you make here with this quote from Charles, right? The general disposing of that people to an entire submission and obedience to our government, that's what the orders to Colonel, right? All designs of profit for the present seem unreasonable and may possibly obstruct the more necessary design upon their obedience and loyalty.
thank you.
Right,
thank
so
you.
they don't care about the profit.
Right,
It's
right.
about,
Yeah.
yeah,
Exactly. Now, I'll give it back to you in a
Can I
sec.
say something?
Yeah.
May I use the microphone?
yeah.
Thanks. Just, I want to really dwell on this, because the myth, we hear this all the time, the United States was built on slavery, Well, what you see is the slavery was deployed by the British to destroy the United States. This is very important, and I would say you can think for a moment about what's happening now with the migrant population as well. This is typical British policy, is you use one group of people, you deploy them in effect for their own destruction to destroy another group, another society. We heard this from Fletcher Prouty when he described how they got the war going in Vietnam, where they moved people from the north to the south. But this is not a new phenomenon. But it's extremely important with the question of slavery, because you have these people saying, and this nation was built. No, we were not built on slavery. We were nearly destroyed by slavery. And that's not the fault of the people who were enslaved. That was the policy of the British Empire. And you can figure it out. You can think about it. Frederick Douglass describes how he was convinced by all of his masters that when he got to the north, everyone was going to be horribly impoverished because they didn't have the slaves waiting on them. And then he gets to the north and discovers, oh, they have indoor plumbing. Because a machine, in terms of physical labor, with some scientific progress, can be infinitely more effective than a human being at physical work. The point of a human being is the mind. That's what makes a difference. So the point of slavery was to destroy the United States. And I can't say that enough, and we have to, people have to really get this. That's it.
Yep. And go to the next slide if you could. No, I'm sorry, before that. Yep. Yeah, and then, the other point that, that Fred brings out in here is you see this pattern. 1661, Virginia, which had no clear laws on slavery, passes a Barbados-like law making slavery racial, and another in 1662 stating that slavery is inherited from the mother. So thus again, right, so all of Virginia's slave laws are based on the Barbados model. So it's just again and again and again you see, the South of the United States, right? How was slavery so pronounced in the South? Well, we're beginning to get a picture of this, right? I mean, this was a very deliberate.
It's really creating an anti-American colony. I mean, there were Americans there. South Carolina did fight in the American Revolution, and they won to good generals. But South Carolina threatened to leave the American Revolution if slavery was actually banned.
Right.
And they were the one that left. They were the first to secede from the Union.
Right.
And if you ever read the South Carolina Declaration of Secession, anybody who says it wasn't, they say they are against our slavery way of life. That's guaranteed by the Constitution. They just elected a president who is hostile to us, and we're done. And that's what it was. So that's why I call it John Locke, Godfather of the Confederacy. I mean, right. That ought to cause a few people to say, well, come on, what are you really talking about? But I want to get on one point here, which is it was the same thing as the effort to repeal the independence of the colonies. Lord Shaftesbury set up a Council of Trade and Plantations in 1670. And one of his biographies said they were reviewing the Charter of Massachusetts and whether to revoke it. And somebody said, we ought to send them a nasty letter. And someone else said, well, if you don't know the touchy and peevish nation of that place, they might take independence from us altogether if we do that. And Haley, the biographer, said so they were supposed to keep the colonies under control. That they certainly did not do. And so they formed another more secretive council in 1672. Shaftesbury is the president, Locke is the secretary, and it's all in secret. It's very few people, it's all in secret. But the guy who actually who pulled together Shaftesbury's papers, I just want to read you one paragraph. He says, the Council of 1672 formed a very comprehensive and intelligent statement of the essentials of plantation control. Plantation means colony. That's what they mean by that, okay? The draft was undoubtedly written by Shaftesbury and Locke for a preliminary sketches to be found in the Shaftesbury papers, and they drafted it at Shaftesbury's house. And the essential portions of the document are all to be found embodied in one form or another in the instructions and suggestions sent to the planters in the Bahamas and Carolina, colonies which for 2 years had been a kind of experimental station for Shaftesbury's and Locke's ideas. So they're circulating their ideas on how to destroy the independence of Massachusetts and Carolina in the Bahamas, and they're just flip sides of the same coin. It's just, you know, they're not two different operations, and both of them have the effect. And it just, when you look into the personages, how many people have heard of Governor Andros? Governor Andros.
Oh, yeah, we're going to get to him, too.
Okay, we're going to get to him.
We sure are.
I'll just point out in one second, and then I'll go back to you.
No.
Governor Andros spent time in Barbados. He was married to one of the Carolina proprietor's daughters.
Next slide.
And
Next slide, yeah.
Okay. And they made, you know, think about this. I mean, Locke is trying to pass a constitution for the Carolinas, you know, on slavery, serfdom, and hereditary monarchy. In the Council of Trade and Plantations, headed by Shaftesbury, becomes the Lords of Trade and Plantations, but they create a new dominion of New England, you know, to merge them all together, and tell Andros, you go and rule it as governor without any legislator. They send him in to be a British-style governmental dictator. He also is one of the biggest investors in the Royal African Company.
Right.
Right, which is the people who
And so is John Locke,
and
right?
so is John. Oh, Shaftesbury invests, and he tells John Locke to invest. He
Right.
says, put your money
John
in
Locke,
here.
the guy who they tell you is the founder of our great ideas, right? Locke is life, liberty, and property, you know, which of course is not in the...
Well, I must say one thing, though. He did say that we don't know anything. Our mind is born as a blank slate.
Right.
And what better philosophy for a slave state
Right.
than to say, you know, we're born blank.
We have no conscience whatsoever, right?
We'll just shape you into whatever we want to shape you into, right? So that's what Andros is. He's part, you know, and first they make him governor of New York, and then they make him that. And it's up here, too. One of the Carolina Lord Proprietors is owned Virginia. Carteret, George Carteret. But fortunately, he died, and William Penn bought out his widow. But I want to say one last thing before I go to you. This thing in Virginia that you're talking about, and by 1705, they had a law in Virginia that said all slaves are to be considered a real estate, and if there be an altercation between the slave and the master, if the slave happens to die, there are no repercussions to it whatsoever. Okay? This stuff was all pushed through by Governor William Berkeley, who was also
One of these 8 guys.
one of the 8 Carolina Lord Proprietors. And I would just want to read one quote from him. Thank God there are no free schools nor printing in Virginia, and I hope we should not have these for 100 years. For learning has brought disobedience and heresy and sex into the world. Sex, S-E-C-T-S. And printing has divulged them, and libels against the best government. God keep us from both. Okay? And under his rule, Virginia, it doesn't get as bad as Carolina, it becomes about 1/3 slave. Because Virginia was one of the very first colony in the United States, so they've subverted it. So go on.
Yeah, okay, so, all right, so in 1684, finally, the Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter is, what, camera? Oh, can you move it to?
Or whatever, okay, fine.
Okay, 1684, the Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter is officially revoked by the British monarchy. So this is when they send Andros, right?
I think 2 years later or something.
2 years later, they send Andros up there. Yeah, two or three years later, they send him up. This creature, to run the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So you can imagine how he's received there. Next slide, please.
Do you have that?
I sure do.
Oh, yeah. I was hoping you had that.
So in 1688, 1 year before this, there's the so-called Glorious Revolution, where William of Orange marries James II's daughter, Mary, and William and Mary become. But it's a pretty chaotic period, and so the Republicans with a small R in the Massachusetts Bay Colony take the opportunity to arrest Andros, along with Dudley, the creep he was working with there, right? And they march him off. Now, so he goes back to England, but then William of Orange makes him governor of Virginia. Send him back, and he then becomes governor of Virginia. I mean, it's one incestuous pool after the next, right? So now, okay, so go to the next slide. So their charter's been revoked, but what Cotton Mather does is he issues a paper. Now this is the first paper currency ever created, in the modern world. They say that there were experiments in paper currency in China, but there's not much documentation of that. So here's the first paper currency created. They're basically saying, we're not going to be held slaves to the British pound sterling or the British shillings or whatever. We're not going to be held slaves to this silver. We're going to use paper currency for credit in our republic, in our Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so he writes a paper, or it's called Some Considerations on Bills of Credit. This is Cotton Mather. And he's basically chastising the population of Massachusetts Bay Colony. He says, because people are saying, well, we don't want to use paper currency, we want silver, we want, real hard currency. He says, what is the security of your paper money less than the credit of the whole country? Country. He uses the word country. 'Tis strange, yea, that the bill, as I have heard, of any magistrate, the bill, the paper, right, of any magistrate in the Western English plantation shall buy any commodities of any of the planters, and yet our people in this pure air be so sottish as to deny credit to the government when 'tis of their own choosing, the government of their own choosing. Had the single gentleman above named a good bottom for their credit in their warehouses, and are not the whole estates of the Massachusetts as good? Is the security of one plantation magistrate better than all the Massachusetts representatives? Can that one magistrate give force to the contracts, and cannot all our government do the same? If we are reduced to Hobbes's state of nature, which says is a state of war, and then the strongest must sake all, I say if such foolish conceits were not entertained, there would not be the least scruple in accepting your bills as current pay. So this is really, really polemical.
Does he say Hobbesian?
He says Hobbes. He attacks Hobbes. If we are once reduced to Hobbes' state of nature, we are in a state of war of man, all against all.
Yeah.
He attacks Hobbes. He's attacking the British so-called Enlightenment philosophers here. So this is really amazing. 1 year later, Andros becomes governor of Virginia. Go to the next slide. So I just want to develop a bit more about this important figure, Cotton Mather, who writes this paper. One of the most beautiful things ever written is this essay, To Do Good, and it had the most profound effect on Benjamin Franklin, who was born 4 years before this paper was written. So you see the continuity here of the Republic of the United States, coming into being from over this 150 years. You see how this works, right? So this essay To Do Good, he says, it is an invaluable honor to do good. It is an incomparable pleasure. A man must look upon himself as dignified and gratified by God when an opportunity to do good is put into his hands. He must embrace it with rapture, as enabling him to answer the great end of his being. Government should vigorously pursue those noble and blessed ends for which it is ordained, the good of mankind. So that's from in there. And I also want to point out his instructions on singing. And I think that the Sons of Liberty, of course, they were famous for having choruses, and so you also see, the seeds of that here.
He wrote a book on singing.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. Yep.
Can you read that for people who can't see it necessarily?
And the accomplished singer instructions. First, how the piety of singing with the devotion may be obtained and
Expressed.
The glorious God, I can't.
Isn't it on there? On your computer?
After an uncommon manner glorifieth it, and his people edified.
Right.
Wow.
All right. So, next slide. Okay, there he is, Ben Franklin. So he was born, as I said, 4 years before this work, the Essays to Do Good, was written, and he read it when he was 11 years old. So, 1717. So this had a tremendous formative effect on him, and Franklin indeed did spend the rest of his life doing good. He created the first public fire department, the first public hospital in Philadelphia when he moved from Boston to Philadelphia. Virginia Governor Alexander Spotswood, which is a whole other class in itself, who was one of the key Virginia governor that got us across the mountains. Anyway, that's a whole other thing, which is totally fascinating. But he made Franklin the postmaster for Philadelphia in 1737. So throughout his life, Ben Franklin was committed to these kinds of public works, public good. He founded the American Philosophical Society in 1744, which was created to spread scientific knowledge to improve the conditions of mankind. He was committed to the general welfare long before the Constitution had concretized the idea. So I think what I'd like to say in summary, and I mean we may have other thoughts on this, and you can summarize as well. I think that people are thinking in terms. People are told that the issue is left versus right. This is a thing that's now. Are you on the left? Are you on the right? This is not the issue. It's Republican with a small r versus oligarchism. And that's the only thing that matters. Left and right don't mean any. Left and right are the playground that the oligarchs play on and manipulate us against each other. The real fundamental issue is this question of republicanism and the view of man in the image of God, and that government is to serve man in that image of God. And that's what the United States Republic was actually founded to be. That's what the Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded. So I was just totally blown away by, you only understand the Massachusetts Bay Colony when you juxtapose it to what Fred elaborates on and brings out, which is remarkable on this question of the evil of the British Empire. So,
Yeah, well,
thank you.
by the way, but just one thing on John Locke and property, because he believes in life, liberty, and property.
Right.
The slaves who were brought over by the Royal African Company were branded with DOY. And you know what DOY stood for? Property of the Duke of York.
Wow.
That was Charles' brothers, James II.
James II, right.
Who founded it, you know?
Right.
But I want to say one thing about the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Company, because these attacks on the United States, and always based on slavery, are part of attacks on the whole idea of the New World, as are attacks on Christopher Columbus. The idea of the New World came out of Nicholas Cusa and his circles, and the idea is that if we're ever going to have the type of liberty that Chris is talking about, we have to get away from Europe because it's just too much run by oligarchs. You can't beat them here. We have to find colonies in the New World. And there's in 1516, Thomas More wrote a book called Utopia. They had just sent Giovanni Cabato to explore the New World. And in Utopia, the only slaves are people sentenced to death. And slavery is a reprieve for them. It's not racial, it's not hereditary. And people in the New World only work 6 hours a day. You know how they can get away with that? They don't have any oligarchs who do nothing and take all the money to support. And then the entity says, you know, I've noticed that the people who don't do anything get all the money and the people who work hard don't get any. It should be the other way around. Shakespeare, in his last play, The Tempest, it's probably based on a shipwreck in Bermuda. He actually calls the people the Bermudes. And there's a guy named Old Gonzalo in it who starts talking about the Commonwealth, and he's basically citing Thomas More. So Shakespeare has these ideas. Miranda in it says, oh, brave new world that has such people in it. And don't blame Shakespeare because, you know, Aldous Huxley tried to destroy that conception later, you know. Francois Rabelais has a whole section in his third book on Utopia, which is based on Thomas More. He's French, they're English. He doesn't care. They are followers of Erasmus. They're trying to build this new civilization. And they understand the importance of populating it. I mean, Rabelais actually says Utopia had like 10 trillion people in it or something like that, not counting children in them. And they talked about the highest skill levels, bringing over the highest skill levels. And that I don't know all about it in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. I need help with that, and I've asked Tim Rush to get some people to work on it. But there was a fight there, too. There was a fight against slavery. The Pope passed an encyclical saying you're not going to enslave the natives. And there was a big fight over whether blacks could be shipped from Africa en masse. They used to be, they had to go to Lisbon or Madrid first, and there was only 2 or 3 of them. And then in 1518, they passed, Charles V passed a resolution saying you could ship 4,000 black people directly from Africa. So the people like, you know, like Winthrop are trying to find that's a beacon on the hill, a new world that's a better world. The oligarchs are going to come over too, and they're going to destroy it. And slavery was one of their main institutions to try and undermine that, because it undermines the morality, it undermines the economy, it undermines the very purpose of it. And in creating Carolina, at the same time as they were trying to revoke the Massachusetts Bay Charter, they knew that they were creating anti-American societies, which is why it ended up in a civil war, right? Now, there's one other, have I got time to go into one other short thing?
Very short.
Okay. What was the first state to ban slavery?
Rhode Island?
New Jersey?
Hmm?
No, I'm not sure.
Before it was the revolution. It was Georgia.
Oh.
I have to tell you this. I took a tour of Georgia once, Savannah, just because it was beautiful. And the tourist guide says, well, General Oglethorpe, he was friends with the Indians. He built the first statue to an Indian, Tomachichi. All these Salzburg Lutherans were escaping. He supported them. All these Jews came over to escape oppression. London wanted them back. He supported them. So I asked the lady, well, surely he didn't oppose slavery. He did. He banned slavery as soon as this place was founded, and he got a law passed in England banning slavery. And he did it. His father was a friend of William Penn. And he did it, he said, to counter what was going on in South Carolina. He saw this, he said, this is going to destroy the Americas. We've got to counter that. I got to prove that you can build a society that is not based on slavery. Now, he had 15 trustees helping him with this. One of them was Thomas Coram, a sea captain. He was also the founder of the Foundlings Hospital, where children who've been abandoned came. And Handel wrote, he not only gave money to it, he wrote a whole anthem for it. And when Oglethorpe brought the natives back to England, he took them to Handel concerts. He took them to Handel concerts. So the music and the singing is, he said, was part of this, and Handel and his music were actually a big part of it. So, but this is this guy should be considered a founding father, and you don't even know about him. You know, I mean, Diana was saying people don't know who their enemies are. We don't need to learn who we are.
Right.
Yeah.